بالضبط. لا المفروض انه قاعد بدخل بالناس اول باول بس لانه الكم كبير. لا موجود حسن، موجود ايات، موجود سندس، في طلاب. ما عشان هيك انا يعني انا بقول لك انه في محاضره مايكرو. طيب فاين شكرا. يعطيكم العافيه يا جماعه، بس حدا ياكد لي انه الصوت واصل.
الصوت واصل.
كان عندكم مايكرو قبل شوي؟
هلا خلصت المحاضرة.
لأن دخلت مرتين أنا فكرت حالي داخل غلط، رجعت شيك على البرنامج الأمور تمام. anyways we are good, we have time so it's okay. خليني أفتح رابط المحاضرة. وصلني كثير أسئلة، حاولت أجاوب على المعظم، تقريبا 90-95% من الأسئلة جاوبت عليها. على بعض الأشياء I will answer it later لأنه بيجي بطبيعة الأشياء. اليوم راح نتكلم عن third lecture بس هو second topic as a topic in biochemistry which describes actually. خليني أعمل share the slide actually. طيب عائشة هذا السؤال إلي؟ كويس. اوكي I will discuss these issues. بعتي لهم على الايميل يا عائشة. خليني اعمل شير سلايد. اوكي we start now. هلا الشيء اللي بنتكلم عنه يعني looks like strange انه talking about oxygen and toxicity of the oxygen, but if you just wait a few seconds and rethink about this topic or this story and imagine, or if you remember the concentration of the oxygen that we have in the atmosphere compared to the nitrogen, so you can understand, and it implies how much important to have certain concentration of oxygen at low concentration or low partial pressure, and if you have high concentration of oxygen, it could cause certain injuries or certain disorders. هلا قصة الأكسجين والتوكسيسيتي بدأت من اكتشاف ما يسمى الأكسيديشن process and what's called oxidative stress in the body. وهذا الكلام بلش بداية السبعينات. الموضوع اللي يتكلم عن الاكسيديتيف ستريس اللي هو الاشياء اللي بتعمل اوكسيديشن، والاكسيديشن بالمناسبه بيختلف شويه عن الاكسجينيشن، بس لان الاكسجين is involved as a final acceptor for the electrons that's why it's called oxidative process. الاكسيديشن بمعنى اخر هي القدره على انه انت تاخذ electrons من substrate معين and this will cause certain damage to certain molecules. وباختصار كل هذا الشابتر بيحكي عن possible bad effect or negative effect of oxidation, whether if it comes from the oxygen molecule or any oxidizing agent on our macromolecules، الجزيئات الكبيره اللي هم الدي ان اي، الار ان اي as nucleic acid طبعا هذول، البروتينز and the lipids، وهذول المولكيولز كلهم components ضروريين للستركتشر. بتلاحظ ان الكربوهيدرات شوي بعيده عن موضوع الاكسيديشن ستريس او الاكسيديتيف ستريس. هلا زي ما حكيت قبل شوي انه the story of the toxicity of the oxygen dated back to 70s of the last century when they actually nominated declared the concept of what's called oxidative stress, and then they discovered that these discoveries came from the toxic effect of molecular oxygen itself in the 50th of the last century, and other studies continued to explore the effect of oxygen and the formation of radicals and superoxide molecules and other factors or atoms that will cause oxidation inside the body. And in order to make things clear when we talk about oxidative stress, for example, or let's say free radicals or ROS species, it's very important to notice the following and to understand the difference between free radicals and ROS species. In fact, what you see here is ROS species اللي هم اختصار لكلمة reactive oxygen species that will be formed due to the oxidative stress, like having, for example, superoxide anion اللي هو تعبير عن جزيء الأكسجين، وجود نقطة على أساس إنه radical, and we have an anionic behavior or because it has negative charge. Okay, this is because incomplete number of oxygen or electrons around the orbitals of the oxygen molecule. And here we have another radical which is called hydroperoxyl radical, and the dot, as I said, اللي هو بتشيل لأنه هذا عبارة عن radical أو ما يسمى بالفري radical. Hydroxyl radical itself, it's oxygen with hydrogen, while here we have hydrogen peroxide, but it's not radical, it's reactive oxygen species. So we have free radicals and we have reactive oxygen species. تمام؟ فreactive oxygen species هي تشمل جزء من الفري radicals. فمش كل free radicals reactive oxygen species and vice versa. The oxygen itself, this is the normal structure of the oxygen, and this is the hydroxyl ion. It's reactive oxygen species, but it's not a free radical. So just to know the difference between these two terms. Sometimes للأمانة بالكتب أو references when they talk about the free radicals, they describe them as reactive oxygen species because most of them are containing oxygen. هلا بعد شوي راح نميز بينهم مين هم الراديكالز مين هم مش راديكالز بالنسبة لهذول المولكيولز. هلا دائما ترتبط الاوكسيداتيف ستريس بمصطلح الفري راديكالز او الفري راديكال دامج، تمام؟ بس مش سينونيمز لبعض، مش بدائل لبعض. هلا الفري راديكال دامج معناها في عندنا radicals that are formed اللي هو very active molecules عندهم radical electron that is able to reduce other agents. والاوكسيداتيف ستريس it means the ability to oxidize something, whether if you have oxygen or another factor as an oxidizing agent. هلا الراديكالز بشكل عام هو الجزيئات اللي او المركبات اللي عندهم دوت بهذا الشكل, for example. And in this example, let's say the oxygen as a free radical can accept single electron up to 2 unpaired electrons, والروتيشن تبعهم بيكون بنفس الاتجاه حتى نميزوا عن شيء اسمه singlet oxygen. singlet oxygen بيشبهه ولكن روتيشن لواحد من الالكترون بيكون باتجاه معاكس. هلا هاي يعني physical chemistry issues, we are not that interested in these terms, just to know that we have differences between these atoms once they have the same orientation of the electrons or other orientation. هلا the free radicals in general, they have one or more unpaired electrons. Okay. Reactive oxygen species also not synonyms for free radicals, not the same. Not all free radicals are reactive oxygen species. So many ROS reactive oxygen species like singlet oxygen, as I mentioned before, الشكل تبعه مختلف لأنه الروتيشن تبع الإلكترون مختلف فقط. Hydrogen peroxide is also reactive oxygen species, and these molecules not considered free radicals. We have to have the dot on the molecule in order to say this is a free radical. Okay, so let's have an idea about the reactive oxygen species and which one of them is free radicals and which one is not free radical. These molecules are not free radicals molecules, but they are ROS species, while these are ROS species, but free radicals at the same time because they have these dots to donate or to mention that these molecules are reactive oxygen species and free radicals at the same time. So if you can see here, all of these molecules contain oxygen in different forms, like the superoxide anion molecule, hydroperoxyl radical, hydrogen peroxide, which is one of the famous ROS species, hydroxy radicals, lipid peroxide radical. It means that you have fatty acid and it has this carboxyl group in the radical form. Singlet oxygen, as I mentioned before, we have extra electron, but the rotation is different compared to the radical molecule. Nitric oxide is reactive oxygen species containing oxygen, but it's free radical as well. And peroxynitrate is another molecule that is working as free radical and the active oxygen species, just to have an idea about the molecules, which one is free radical and which one is not. هلا الفري راديكالز اللي بتكونوا من الجسم او داخل الجسم او داخل الخلايا they have sources من وين بيجوا ليش الجسم بيكونهم. هلا واحد من اهم السورسز للفري راديكالز اللي هو مش اللي بالسلايد امامنا ولكن من العمليات اللي بتصير داخل الجسم من اجل انتاج الطاقه اللي هو الاكسيديشن بروسيس and electron transport chain that is carried by the mitochondria. كلنا بنعرف انه في عندنا electrons have to be transported through the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. So as a natural source, a physiological source of free radicals will be the mitochondria itself. When we have more oxidation, more transport of electrons, some of these electrons are going to be leaked and they will result in the formation of the free radicals that we can see. Other sources also natural and physiological, like the function of the macrophages, for example. They have to form these molecules, as you can see here. This is called burst effect of oxygen, who are consumption of the oxygen by white blood cells, and using the NADPH molecule as a reducing agent in order to give electrons to the oxygen in order to be a free radical and active oxygen species at the same time. And this NADPH came from a process which is called or known as a glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase pathway or glucose monoxygenase pathway. كلنا بنعرف انه هاي الباثوي بتعطينا NADPH molecules in all types of cells حتى تكون هي reducing agent حتى نكون هذا المولكيول. هلا بتستفيد الوايت بلاد سيلز من هذا الموضوع انها تكون free radicals and then other kinds of ROS species like hydrogen peroxide because they have this enzyme اللي هو superoxide dismutase. Okay, the first process is catalyzed by the oxidase enzyme, which is known as NADPH dependent oxidase enzyme. The second enzyme is the superoxide dismutase enzyme اللي بيحول السوبروكسايد الى hydrogen peroxide and monoxygenase peroxidase enzyme is able to convert our hydrogen peroxide to what's called hypochlorate molecule at the end of the day by using the ions of the chloride. Why the cells, white blood cells, are forming such molecules? هلا هذا جزء من الفيزيولوجي تبعهم to form toxic material to the bacterial cells. So as part of the immune system, they have to do this process. هلا إذا زاد الموضوع عن حده بالنسبة لل ROS species أو free radicals, they can destroy our macromolecules, our toxic or our macromolecules by toxicity of these oxidizing agents. هلا الخروج من هذا المأزق يتم من خلال consumption of these molecules. How the body is going to perform like what's called defense against these molecules. We have defense mechanisms in order to consume these molecules. Assume that we started with such reaction, اللي هو generation of the radical of oxygen and then hydrogen peroxide by gaining hydrogen and electrons. So we can generate other free radicals or ROS species, and this species can be converted at the end of the day to water molecule in order to be safe product. This process actually is catalyzed by certain mechanisms that we have in our body. And what we are going to discuss is how the body is able to resist these oxidative stress agents or free radical formation in the body. Otherwise, we will have problems like, for example, mutations of the DNA and certain defects in certain enzymes and macromolecules. هلا واحدة من الكاركترستكس للأور species إنه بيخلي موضوع دراستها صعب جدا اللي هو they are extremely reactive with short lifespan. It means that it's not easy to study these molecules in vitro or in vivo sometimes. So we rely on the presence or the measurement of the enzymes that are responsible for the consumption of these ROS species. And the other problem is the chain that will be formed by these ROS species or free radicals because of the extreme reactivity and short half-life. So because they are extremely reactive, they will cause a chain of reactions that will produce different types of free radicals with different types of toxicity, and it will result in the damage of different tissues in our body. And this is the the most dangerous thing. Let me answer just. Okay. Now, again, the ROS species are going to be generated normally or sometimes pathologically in our body due to certain defects of certain enzymes اللي هو antioxidant enzymes or antioxidants اللي هم natural antioxidants. حدا بده يسألني شيء؟
دكتور يعطيك العافية.
يا هلا.
دكتور بس أغلبك ترجع للسلايد اللي وراه.
Yes.
دكتور التفاعلات هاي اللي بالسلايد هذا هي نفس تفاعلات الريدكشن للROS.
Yes, when you are giving electrons you are doing reduction of these ROS species. بس تنساش انه احنا بالنص هذول المولكيولز هذول كلهم ROS species صاروا. هلا بعرف شو قصدك بانه reduction. Yes, you are doing reduction by addition of electrons to these molecules. So you need reducing agents in order to do this. هلا reducing agents هذول ممكن يكونوا مركبات برضه free radicals او safe product at the end of the day. Yes, they are called reduction process. Okay. هلا الغريب في الامر انه تقريبا less than 4% of our oxygen are used or consumed to produce or can be converted to what's called free radicals, as I mentioned before and we discussed already, the whole mitochondrial process of ROS production. And sometimes this thing could be dangerous and harmful. And let's give you an example of this حتى تشعر بأهمية أو تفهم أهمية ال ROS species that are generated by mitochondrial action. هلا كلنا نعرف إنه الميتوكوندريا فيها DNA, and this DNA is almost limited from the point of view of the genes as well as the size, as well as limited repairing system. هاي واحد الأشياء المهمة جدا بالنسبة للميتوكوندريا. Compared with the genomic DNA, repairing system في النيوكليوس العادية في الجينوم العادي very efficient compared to the mitochondrial one. بمعنى آخر إنه repairing في mitochondrial genome is very limited. هلا when you have such kind of oxidants like ROS or free radicals, they will cause a damage to the DNA molecule due to the high reactivity of these species, and the mitochondrial DNA is subjected to high rate of mutation. تمام؟ هلا high rate of mutation بالنسبة للmitochondrial DNA sometimes appears as a disease that will affect the function of the mitochondria اللي هو energy production لأنه DNA صار معطوب عندها. اوكي؟ هلا هذا الموضوع بيعتمد على أشياء كثير من ضمنها كمية الROS damage اللي بيصير بالميتوكوندريا and how much is targeting the mitochondrial DNA, as well as the number of the copies that you have of the DNA in each mitochondria, and how many mitochondria you have in the, or mitochondria in fact, in the cell itself. فكل ما كان عدد الميتوكوندريا أقل subjected to more mutation فبكون الإفكت واضح أكثر. وعشان أوضح الصورة أكثر مقارنة بين for example sperm and any other type of cells. السبيرم عدد الميتوكوندريا ما عنده ميتوكوندريا واحد وبيكون كبير وملتف حول الاكسون تبع او النك نسميه تبع السبيرم. فالسبيرمز من اكثر الاورجنز اكشوالي او الستركتشرز اللي subjected to mutations for the mitochondrial DNA, وممكن يكون له علاقه بكثير اشياء من ضمنها الانفيرتيلتي، ولكن بيعوض هذا الشيء الملايين من سبيرمز اللي بيتم انتاجها in order to have functional sperm and normal sperm. هلا ليش هذا الموضوع جدا مهم للسبيرم؟ لانه هو حركه السبيرم بتعتمد على وجود الانرجي اللي بتعتمد على وجود functional mitochondria in order to have successful fertilization process. Just to mention the importance of the oxidation damage or oxidative damage that will cause sometimes certain types of infertility. These are the sources or other sources of the reactive oxygen species اللي هو xanthine oxidase enzyme and aldehyde oxidase enzyme. These are enzymes that form superoxide anions as a radical as well as hydrogen peroxide. And we have NADPH oxidase enzyme اللي شفناه بالwhite blood cells and many other cells. Nitric oxide synthase is also responsible for the production of these reactive oxygen species. The lipooxygenase, so we have many enzymes, many mechanisms that can generate reactive oxygen species, and these factors are called biological factors. We have also physical factors like radiations and certain types of wavelengths like the lambda wavelengths. Other chemical factors, if you want to classify them to biological and physical and chemical, like the cigarette smoke and certain pollutants, as well as the reduction of the oxygen in the environment or certain conditions of hypoxia. And the mitochondria will start to do what's called alternative respiration chain to produce nitric oxide molecules. So all of these mechanisms are responsible for the production of these reactive oxygen species, and the damage will be higher when we have more free radicals. And the target molecule, most of the time, as a dangerous one, the most dangerous one is the nucleic acid as DNA molecule. So it's not easy story to talk about. ويعني خليني احكيها بشويه حياديه كمان، انه معظم الكتب اللي بتناقش البايوكيمستري او بتتكلم عن البايوكيمستري مش كثير بتلاقي فيها توسع في موضوع الاوكسيداتيف ستريس and the mechanism of the antioxidant effect. Nowadays, the literature is talking about the effect of the oxidative stress and the relationship between the oxidative stress and certain disorders like infertility or cancer or any other metabolic disorders. So these are the reactions that you have to be familiar with and what they produce. For example, the superoxide dismutase is going to convert your free radicals from being highly toxic to less toxic molecules. H2O2 في عندنا peroxidase enzyme بيقدر يخلصنا منه، فهو أقل سمية من الفري radicals. And the catalase as well is another enzyme that will convert H2O2 to water, for example. Glutathione peroxidase is also able to reduce oxidizing agents in order to be less toxic. Glutathione peroxidase is another mechanism that is responsible for the reduction of the presence of the certain reactive oxygen species. Myeloperoxidase as well. وهذا الرياكشن ممكن يكون سبب في انه في بعض الايجنتس الثانيين يكونوا reduced by transferring of the electrons from one molecule to another. Sometimes there are specific reactions that involve iron, for example, by Haber-Bosch reaction, اللي هو بيخلصنا من one of the free radicals by generation of another one, and there is sequential reaction in the future. Glutathione reductase بيختلف عن الglutathione peroxidase enzyme. The first one is converting the reduced form to oxidized form, while here from oxidized to reduced form. Okay. وهذول reactions مرتبطين ببعض، رح نحكي عنهم بعد شوي لما نحكي عن oxidative pathway. خلينا نشوف السؤال. حفظ؟ يس. ابراهيم. مش كثير صعبين اعتقد، لانه هذول الاثنين مربوطين ببعض، رح نشوفهم بعد شويه. الكاتاليز very easy to understand. superoxide dismutase حكينا عنه قبل شويه. And here we have NADPH oxidase برضه حكينا عنه, very easy one, which forms the free radical here that is responsible for the formation of hydrogen peroxide in the future and then by myeloperoxidase. بعدين بتكون الهايبوكلوريت بالوايت blood cells. الفنتون reaction is another reaction that consumes iron in order to convert our hydrogen peroxide to free radical as a hydroxyl molecule. And these are just some examples of the interconversion of the reactive oxygen species. Normally, as I described before, هذول molecules الجسم بيعملهم بشكل طبيعي بشكل فيزيولوجي، ولكن المشكلة أحيانا بتصير في عندنا في البالانس between these molecules and يعني بمعنى آخر الoxidation process and the reduction process in the body اللي هو antioxidant mechanism. So we have endogenous sources as we described اللي حكينا عنهم قبل شوية، وفي عندنا antioxidant mechanisms that work against these molecules، وفي عندنا exogenous mechanisms. هذول الفاكتورز مع بعضهم، وهنا حاط انا البوليفينول زياده عشان اشير لاهميه بعض المركبات العشبيه او فوائد النباتات لما يكون عندهم polyphenols as antioxidant agents. عشان هيك يعني ينصح بتناول او بشرب بعض انواع من مستحضرات النباتات زي الشاي على سبيل المثال، خلينا نكون يعني ادق شويه. وليش بفضلوا الشاي الاسود على الاخضر والى اخره حسب الريسيرش طبعا، او بعض الفينولز as antioxidant agent وكيف بيمنعوا development of certain diseases like cancer for example or metabolic disorders. هلا this process of production and consumption of the molecules is under homeostasis. So we will have normal metabolism, normal growth of the cell if we have normal production and normal consumption of these molecules. Under impaired conditions, we could develop certain disorders depending on the increase or decrease of these factors. إذا صار نقصان بهذول الفاكتورز اللي هم الROS species, we will have certain defects like defense mechanism will be reduced and certain proliferation function will be reduced as well, اللي هو انقسام الخلايا والتميز. On the other hand, if they are increased, we will have damage to our cells which may lead to development of senescence اللي هو الaging، يصير خرف أكثر، يعني بمعنى آخر aging أكثر للخلايا، هذا بسموه senescence process, and certain metabolic disorders, cell death, which is sometimes good in cell death rather than developing a tumor if the cells are going to resist, for example, the death itself. So we have a balance between a production of these ROS species and the consumption of these species. مشان نسهل السؤال على مين اللي سألني السؤال إنه حفظ ولا لا. This is example of the Fenton reaction and Harvard-West reaction. Both of them are using iron. Just to know that we have these kinds of reaction. ما بديش تفاصيل تبع reaction, and it will consume iron in order to produce hydroxyl radical, which can be neurotoxic free radical. Again, if we have certain kind of unbalanced counts will measure in a human body such as nope. هاي التكنيكس حدا بيسألني عن السي تي سكان والام ار اي انه بنقيس فيهم الROS species. Not easy. Actually these techniques are not able to diagnose or to detect these markers. What we do actually we measure the activity of certain enzymes. يعني بنلتف عليها شوية. احنا ما بنقيس. We can measure these factors إذا بنعمل generation for example بالمختبر. ولكن حتى نشوف إنه في عندنا على سبيل المثال oxidative stress ولا لا، بنقيس الانزيمز اللي involved في هذا الموضوع. يعني بالذات على سبيل المثال superoxide dismutase activity. It means that we are at exposure of these factors. فبيأشر إنه في عندنا مثلا هيدروجين بيروكسيد زيادة إذا كانت كتاليز عالية النشاط، فالجسم عماله بيعمل action against these molecules. طيب طيب في حدا فاتح الكاميرا يسكرها يا جماعة. حدا يفتح الكاميرات خصوصا خواتي البنات، الله يرضى عليك. صح، وقرارات التعليم العالي بانه الكاميرات تكون مفتوحه عشان انتراكتيف تيتشنج، ولكن برضو احنا مجتمع شوي عندنا نوع من الغيره خلينا نسميها المحافظه. البنات خصوصا ما تفتحوش الكاميرات رجاء، لان ما بعرف شو الاستخدام بصير بعدين. طيب ثانك يو، شكرا يا عمر. الان اذا كان في عندي نوع من non homeostatic behavior in the body، انه في عندنا oxidants كثيره من الROS species، وفي عندنا deficiency او less activity بالانتي اوكسيدانتس اللي ممكن تكون enzymatic وممكن تكون non enzymatic زي الفيتامينز اللي كثير بيشجعوا على خلينا نقول supplementary intake of these vitamins because they work as antioxidant. وبالمناسبه هون بدنا نحكي عن شيء مهم جدا بالنسبه للانتيوكسيدنت فيتامينز، انه ما تكون مستحضرات، لانه بالعاده لما تكون مستحضرات مجرد ما تعرضت للهواء بصير لها اوكسيديشن. فيفضل دائما ان ناخذها من مصادرها الطبيعيه. فيتامين سي اني احصل عليه من المصدر الطبيعي مباشره rather than انه اخذه على شكل for example tablets or whatever. just انه حتى نحصل على اكبر فائده. هلا بالاضافه انهم هذول انتي اوكسيدنتس they have other functions in the body, so we have to take them as normal supplements. Okay. The question here that I would like to raise when we talk about the oxygen, what that has to do with oxygen, I mean oxidation process. وقلت أنا بالبداية إنه الأكسجين او الاكسجينيشن بروسيس تختلف شوي عن الاكسيديشن بروسيس itself. الاكسيديشن معناها you are taking electrons from certain substances. هلا الاكسجين من الجزيئات اللي موجوده او كذره موجوده بشكل هائل جدا، تقريبا نص المولكيولز الموجوده او الذرات نصها تقريبا عباره عن اكسجين. بالجو هو لا يشكل اكثر من 20%، اذا زاد راح يصير في عندنا مشكله. عشان هيك في تحفظ على موضوع علاج بعض الاشخاص بالهاي دوز اوف اكسجين، خصوصا فيما يسمى treatment of autism by oxygen exposure. I don't know what is the reason for that, but you have to be careful when you supply oxygen to these individuals. هلا جسم الانسان بيحتوي على كميه كبيره من الاكسجين. functions of our cells rely on the oxidation process using oxygen. لا بالنسبه لاول سلايد اسماء العلماء والتواريخ no, it's not that important. Just to mention the or to show يعني historical overview of the topic. حدا بيسالني عن لا يمكن مش هيك. هلا 65% من جسم الانسان يحتوي على الاكسجين، وبروسيسز تحتاج الى الاكسجين زي respiration واذر metabolic actions in our body as well as drug metabolism. هو بنحول الدراجز من toxic الى non toxic ب increase of the solubility of these drugs or toxins or poisons. هلا according to this the oxygen is good molecule. On the other hand, if we have high concentration of oxygen or exposure to oxidative stress due to the presence of the oxygen and involvement of the oxygen in this process, like these mechanisms, as we can see here, so it can be toxic. And one of the most, as an example, toxic radicals is the hydroxyl radicals that can attack lipids, DNA, as well as protein. That's why the body is responsible for taking action in order to reduce the toxicity by having the catalase enzyme or peroxidase enzyme of the glutathione, the thing that we are going to discuss in the next few slides. So according to this, it looks like as bad molecule if it's imbalanced from the point of view of consumption and production. Okay, again, the mitochondria is one of the organs that, or organelles actually, that is responsible for the generation of ROS species. If we have high production of these reactive oxygen species due to abnormal physiological function of the mitochondria, there will be a problem in the general term. Normally, this process of generation of hypochlorite goes back to the function of the myeloperoxidase enzyme, which converts the hydrogen peroxide اللي حكينا عنه من شوي with the chloride to this toxic molecule in order to attack the bacteria. And this requires the presence of oxygen radical that will be generated by the complex that is known as an ADPH dependent oxidase complex, and it has to have reducing agent, which is an ADPH molecule that can be generated by two major mechanisms. واحدة منها المالك enzyme, والثاني الأكسجين phosphate pathway, as I described before. So at the end of the day, we need this process of generation of the ROS species, but at for certain extent, and we have to develop defense against these ROS generation mechanisms. Now, the cellular injury occurs through the production of ROS species. It is due to the presence of these molecules, اللي هم most toxic molecules, superoxide anions, hydroxyl radicals, and hydrogen peroxide. هذول من أكثر المركبات اللي بيتم إنتاجهم ك oxidizing agents in a toxic form. هلا we have defense mechanisms against these molecules اللي هو ال SOD superoxide dismutase. وهذا جواب على سؤال أحد الشباب إنه إحنا بنقدر نعمل measurement للROS species. لا، إحنا بنعمل measurement للactivity of these enzymes. بنشوف الاكتيفيتي للsuperoxide dismutase, للglutathione peroxidase, reductase, catalase, and this is يعني natural defense, خلينا نسميه chemical defense by taking polyphenols, by drinking certain preps of herbs اللي هم المستحضرات الأعشاب اللي لأنه النباتات بشكل عام تحتوي على كثير من الفينولز. They are known as polyphenol production creatures. هلا زي ما حكينا بالبدايه السوبروكسايد dismutase بخلص من السوبروكسايد molecules بحولهم لليس توكسيك molecule, and hydrogen peroxide can be converted by oxidase enzyme to form water, and this needs what's called glutathione as a reduced form in order to take the action. So this is peroxidase enzyme. glutathione peroxidase enzyme، فممكن تضيف حرف G هون كده. and this is called glutathione reductase enzyme. هلا لازم تكون الميكانيزم هاي دائما موجوده عشان اعمل جنريشن لهذا المولكيول. انا بهمني بكل هاي القصه انه يضل عندي مخزون من الريديوست فورم اوف جلوتاثيون، لان دائما بستهلكه انا في الخلايا حتى يخلصني من H2O2 اللي انا كونته بالبدايه. وهذا بتطلب انه ارجع المولكيول من حالته الاوكسيدايزد للريديوست باي ريدكتيز انزيم. اتس جلوتاثيون ريدكتيز انزيم، وهذا جلوتاثيون بيروكسيديز انزيم بحرف الجي. هلا عشان اعمل هاي العمليه عمليه الريدكشن I need reducing agent اللي هو ال NADPH molecule that can be generated by G6PD enzyme اللي هو الجلوكوز 6 dehydrogenase enzyme من الباثوي اللي كنا نعرفها اللي هو الكسوزمان phosphate pathway. If you remember that, of course, in biochemistry, and I do believe you remember that. Another defense mechanism that we have in our body is catalase. So if you have this molecule, it will be less toxic because you have different defense mechanisms, the whole enzymatic mechanisms that can consume the formation of the H2O2 molecule. Okay, so let me clear the slide first of all. Okay, so this is the same process again, who are generation of the free radicals and ROS species, and this is the last step if you want to consume it and prevent the toxicity. And this is again the same thing that we described before. You convert this molecule to less toxic molecule, and the catalase can return it to water and oxygen, as well as the action of the glutathione peroxidase enzyme can consume hydrogen peroxide with water, but this requires the presence of glutathione structure in a reduced form. وهون إذا بدي أكمل عملية أرجع أتذكرها. It's very easy principle. I have to regenerate the reduced form by glutathione reductase enzyme process، وهذا طلب وجود ال NADPH molecule. sorry NADPH مش عارف أكتب لأنه هذا okay. The superoxide dismutase enzyme also generated the hydrogen peroxide as well as the oxygen as a less toxic molecules. شوي خليني أحكي عن شغلة تخص البيوكيمستري since we are talking about biochemistry concepts of ROS اللي هو الجلوتاثيون structure. كلنا بنعرف الجلوتاثيون عبارة عن ترايبيبتايد، بس طريقة ارتباطه مختلفة عن الترايبيبتايدز اللي بنعرفهم. احنا بنعرف ان البيبتايدز او الامينو اسيدز بيرتبطوا مع بعض بالبيبتايد بوند. هلا هون الستركتشر شوي مختلف، بيرتبطوا من ناحيه السايد تشين، بالتالي الستركتشر تبعهم is completely different. They are called gamma, for example, binding molecules, and known as glutathione, which consists of glutamate, cysteine, and glycine. هلا السيستين هو اللي بيلعب دور اساسي في الفانكشن تبع الجلوتاثيون، اما بيكون ريديوست بهذا الشكل او بيكون اوكسيدايزد. لما بيكون ريديوست بيكون على شكل ترايبيبتايد. هلا هذا بقدر اسميه هيكسابيبتايد، بمعنى اخر انه في عنده 2 molecules of جلوتاثيون، فيه 6 احماض امينيه، 2 جلوتاميت 2 سيستين، and اللي هو السيستاين بريدج بسويه، و2 جلايسين as just يعني kind of clarification of things. هلا في الميكانيزمز اللي بتكون معتمده على اشياء غير انزيميه زي الجلوتاثيون itself، الفيتامين سي، E, A, uric acid. These are called non-enzymatic antioxidant compounds or molecules. We have also the polyphenols as antioxidant defense mechanisms in nature. هلا الدمج اللي حكينا عنه قبل شوي يعني تكاد تكون المواضيع مكرره شوي، ولكن هون بدي اركز على الاورجن themselves. The ROS species they could target the DNA, the mitochondria itself, and destroying the ability to produce energy. وهون ممكن يسبب مشاكل الميلز خصوصا في موضوع الفيرتيليتي. It could destroy the membrane of the cell and eventually the cell is going to be damaged. وهذا الحكي بيأثر على خلايا صعب إنتاجها مرة أخرى زي النيرفس سيستم for example. So it will be lethal for or very harmful to the nervous system much more than other organs. زي ما حكينا بدنا نلخص الأشياء اللي مرتبطة ب خلينا نسميهم clinical significant factors or the clinical significance of the ROS species. What are the diseases that could be developed if we have overproduction of these species or less defense mechanism? Chronic inflammation, for example, like rheumatoid arthritis, could be developed. Glomerulonephritis, damage of the renal system. Acute inflammation could be caused by the production of these molecules. Respiratory problems or respiratory diseases, like what's called a bronchopulmonary dysplasia, due to the exposure of the newborn individuals to high concentration of oxygen. So we have to be careful. Or the development of what's called ARDS, or adult respiratory distress syndrome in the adult. So exposure to high oxygen is not that good as we think. Our eyes are very sensitive, especially the retina, to the exposure to the oxygen and the effect of the ROS species, and it could lead to what's called cataract as a consequence of the ROS species. Reperfusion disease, another kind of damage that could be caused by specific activity of xanthine oxidase during ischemia, or reduction of the supply of the oxygen and production of high oxidants. Atherosclerosis is one of the most important diseases that are related to the oxidative stress and the formation of CRP protein and accumulation of the LDL. It's a very complicated story in order to understand actually, or to reveal and explore the atherosclerosis as well as the formation of the plaque itself. Many factors have been connected to the plaque formation بعدين myocardial infarction أو coronary heart disease اللي هو الأمراض المرتبطة بالهارت أو coronary system. السبب إنه في كثير فاكتورز ارتبطوا بهذا الموضوع، من ضمنهم ال LDL على سبيل المثال، oxidative stress and the action of the oxidative stress on the LDL, the CRP اللي هو C-reactive protein and its role in the development of inflammation at that site. So once you have inflammation, you have immune action that will produce oxidizing agents, and then conversion of the LDL to its, let's say, abnormal structure that may be related to the development of myocardial infarction and or stroke maybe, but totally we are describing plaque formation by the accumulation of the LDL. So it's sequential actions that will be related to the development of the either atherosclerosis or myocardial infarction. Certain injuries, they are known as shock-related injuries in certain tissues. Skin diseases, one of the most important or one of the major actually disorders could appear just بتظهر على شكل aging. Once we have high oxidation or high ROS action or oxidative stress, the skin will show kind of aging or senescence. وانا مختصرها بالاخير حاكي عن شيء اسمه aging process سواء على السكن او غير السكن. واحد من الامراض اللي كثير بيتكلموا عنها وعلاقتها بالارواس سبيشيز اللي هو الكارسينوجينيسيس and the possible treatment of the cancers or prevention of the development of cancer by taking antioxidant factors. هدول بديش اياهم بصراحه بنفس التركيب، يعني خليني اكون شوي كمان reasonable. لما بحكي عن الدي ان اي damage, I have many things that are related to the why the DNA is going to be damaged, because we are going to change our nitrogen bases basically. يعني أنا هذا اللي بدي أفهم من هذا الموضوع. Generation of these unusual molecules will cause mutations. أنت لما تغير بالقواعد النيتروجينية الموجودة في الدي ان اي, it means that you are causing change in the nitrogen base, and then you are changing the sequence of the DNA nucleotide موجود في هذا السيكونس, وبالتالي possibility of developing a mutation. So that's why إنه هذول أو ال ROS related to the DNA damage. هو mutation much more than being damage to the DNA. If it's damaged, sometimes it would be better than developing a mutation. هلا واحد من الأشياء اللي ممكن برضو فيها جواب للسؤال اللي انسأل قبل شوي إنه how we measure ال ROS أو نشوف الإفكت تبع ال ROS. أنا يعني هاي الدراسة من لما بدأت السيستم محتفظ فيها بكل صراحة, لأنه it shows the importance of the what's called ROS species development and defense mechanism that we have in our blood, and how it's going to be developed during, for example, gestation and let's say after delivery. So this table actually compares infants by gestational age at birth, which means that this is the gestational age in weeks. This is the period from 23 to 33, for example, weeks. And this is older infant. Okay. And this is the test اللي هو عبارة عن comparison between these two groups. Okay. ففي عندنا group number 1, group number 2. And if you do the t-test, you will get the p-value. Okay. To see the difference between the components that you could have, like ferric oxide, for example, or oxide, like a partial pressure of oxygen between these two groups. And here the most important thing is the concentration of the oxidized glutathione and the reduced glutathione. Okay, if you take a look to these numbers here, there is a difference. There is a reduction in the oxidized one, and there is an increase in the reduced one if you compare the first group with the second group. Okay, and if you take the ratio, which is more representative here, اللي هو a ratio between the reduced and oxidized one, it jumped from 6 to 12. So it has like 2 times of expression of them, or the ratio value between these two groups, which implies the significance of the production of the reduced glutathione at this period of time due to high oxidation stress during this period of pregnancy. So this is how we do actually the monitoring of the ROS by just studying the enzymes that are working or the molecules that are working as antioxidant. So هاي الدراسة بتشير إنه في عندنا ريشيو أعلى من reducing agent اللي هو reduced glutathione, which means that the body needs to do more antioxidant activity or more consumption of reduced oxidizing agents that have been already formed during this period of time. فهذا بميز انه في عندنا مرحلتين اثناء النمو بيتم فيها انتاج الROS species بكميات مختلفه وبيحتاج الى oxidizing او reducing agent بكميات اكبر. هلا ممكن تروح تقيس انت مثلا dismutase enzyme, for example. It depends on the or catalase enzyme activity. So all of these parameters can be measured in order to understand the effect of the oxidizing agent. And here we can see that by just comparing the partial pressure of the oxygen, اللي هو arterial blood pressure of the oxygen, which will be higher in these individuals or these infants compared to the first group. So simple study that just show the importance of the and how we measure actually the parameters when we talk about ROS species. مرة ثانية الموضوع بيعيد نفسه اللي هو the protein could be damaged because you are going to change one of the most important amino acids in the protein structure اللي هو cysteine. If you oxidize it, for example, or reduce it, it will destroy the 3D structure of the protein. الاس بوند واحدة من أهم الروابط الموجودة في البروتينات تحافظ على الستركتشر تبعها. So if you oxidize it, it will be very toxic effect on that protein, and it will destroy the cell as well as many other functions. تأثر على enzymes activity. Okay. There will be also change on the DNA as well as lipid structure due to the exposure to the oxidizing agent, and the rest of the things are just a clinical description of what are the things that could be affected, like the injury of the respiratory system due to the exposure to high oxidizing agent. Just go through them by reading the general concept of these things. Lipid peroxidation, I'm not that interested in the detailed process of how we do that, because we have series of reactions. But at the end of the day, يعني بغض النظر صنفهم initiation or propagation or termination process, how the lipids are going to be oxidized by these oxidizing agents, and how the body is going to make defense by having either external or internal endogenous or exogenous factors that could prevent the effect actually or the action of the ROS species. يمكن حكيت أنا بشكل سريع عن هاي المحاضرة because we just have this lecture and the next one to talk about the next topic. أي سؤال كالعادة ابعتوا لي على الإيميل أو بأي طريقة للتواصل. I'll try to answer most of the questions. It depends on my time. الشابتر حكيت بالبداية أنا من الصعب جدا أن تلاقي شابتر مختص في هذا الموضوع، بس في شابتر على سبيل المثال أعتقد رقم 47 بهاربرز، وفي شابتر آخر I think لأنه أنا ماخذهم من أكثر من شابتر هذول المواضيع، ف it's not easy to take them from just one reference. اوكي I will send it to you انه ايش الشابترز نحددهم. بس بتذكر شابتر 47 بهاربرز، وفي الكتاب اللي احنا متمدينه اصلا للسيستمز اللي هو تكست بوك اوف ميديكال او بايوكيمستري فور ميديكال ستودنتس اللي هو فازوديبام. It talks in some details about these topics. ففي عندنا text book of biochemistry for medical students and Harvard's illustrated biochemistry, another textbook that you can go back to read from. Very interesting and not easy to study. يعطيكم الف عافيه، شكرا يا جماعه. See you يوم الخميس ان شاء الله.